if you're not familiar with this highway, I think probably most folks here are a little bit familiar with it. At least you might have heard about it in the news. But it's a proposed highway. It's almost 60 kilometers long, and it goes starts at the 400 up in Vaughan and goes all the way down to where the 407 and the 401 meet, just north of Oakville. So that highway it was previously canceled. Susan's going to tell you a little bit more about that, and then revived by the Ford government. And the highway would go through a whole lot of sensitive ecosystem, green spaces, habitats, people's homes. It also goes through Indigenous treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And this highway, not only will it cause ecological devastation, but it also will cause a whole lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is an example of one of the projects that our provincial government needs to think about and think about its impact on her greenhouse gas emission targets and the promises that they've made. It's one of those projects that they need to not do in order to fight climate change, in addition to the things they promised to actually do. So specifically, how will a new highway make climate change worse? If we can go to slide 2 here. And in this slide, you can see that right now, transportation emissions in Ontario are the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And why is that? It's really simple. Cars and trucks. It's from vehicles. It's from us driving around. And building a new highway means that greenhouse gas emissions from the cement and asphalt that go into building this highway, but more from all the vehicles, the cars and trucks that are going to be on the road, that these emissions will continue to rise if we keep building highways and encouraging more vehicles to be on the road. And so if you can go to slide 3, actually, this is a slide that no one has ever seen before. This is brand new information that we have not released, and I don't really even have permission to show it tonight, but it just gives you a sense of some modeling that we've just done to show the actual carbon footprint of all those vehicles on Highway 413 and what they estimate it to be. So it would be about, over its 50-year lifespan, or a 50-year lifespan, the highway could last much longer than that, it would be about 35 million tons, 35 megatons. To give you some context, that's the same impact as about 9 coal plants operating for an entire year. So that is quite a large carbon footprint. So putting this single highway in place will mean that many more greenhouse gas emissions are released into the air. And we know that when you add more road space, it doesn't simply pull cars from other roads. It means that more people choose to drive. This is a tried and true proven fact. I think probably Sunny's going to talk about it tonight. But you build more road space, those road spaces just fill up. So this new highway is going to fill up within a few years. That's called induced demand, and we'll see more greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. And that's why we need to focus not only on not building more highways, but we need to focus on building better transit, making better use of existing road spaces like the 407, which sits empty a lot of the time, and plan our cities so that people live closer to where they need to go and they don't need to drive around. When you build more highways, it does the opposite. It forces people to travel farther. Sprawling housing developments and strip malls pop up along the highway, which are all car-dependent destinations. And often the folks who live in these areas get locked into having to drive everywhere, when maybe that's not necessarily what you want. And I'm actually going to skip over slide 4 because I think that Susan is probably going to cover it. Maybe I'll quickly show slide 4. It's a map of the carbon footprints in the GTA area. Just really quickly, you can see around the edges, there's a much higher carbon footprint for folks who, simply live places where you have to drive more often, because those cities are planned in a way that means more driving. And more highways is just going to make that worse. It's going to make those carbon footprints even higher. And that's everything for me. And my contact information is on the next slide. It's the generic Stop the 413 contact info. I'm going to put my email address in the chat. Thank you so much for having me to speak.
Amazing. Thank you, Sarah. Before we let you go, we do have a question for you in the chat from Erica. She asks, given that the Ontario government has passed legislation that makes it much easier to rubber stamp controversial projects, what are the chances of actually stopping this highway from happening? What needs to happen to have it stopped since public opposition hasn't stopped Ford in the past?
Yeah, great question. And under this government, we're finding that campaigns like this are different than they used to be. And I think you'll hear from Susan Swale tonight, who, who ran the first campaign, which actually resulted in this highway being canceled. The way we're running this campaign now is much more. It's much more of a game where you have to get people in extremely large numbers who live in those communities to speak up and show how politically toxic it would be for politicians to support this highway because there is so much opposition to it. You can't just say there's opposition. You can't just point out why this is not a smart idea and how much it's going to cost. You have to show it. So it involves a whole lot more groundwork, I would say. And yes, there's legislation in place or proposed pieces of legislation that mean that this could get rubber stamped more easily. They proposed fast tracking the environmental assessment for this highway. We're fighting that. We're saying that's not okay. You can't do that. And for example, Laura, who's going to be speaking tonight as a lawyer at EcoJustice, who is working really hard with us to ask the federal government to do an environmental assessment. So we're doing what we can, but you're right. It's a much tougher go under this government to fight this highway, which is why we need all the help we can get.
Thank you. So apparently I messed up. The question and answer period is at the end after every speaker, but thank you for taking that. I appreciate it. Great. So now we've got Susan Swale, our next speaker. She'll be speaking to us about the Highway 413 campaign and how it went last time in 2018. She'll also be shedding some light on the importance of urban planning and the dangers of urban sprawl. Oh, Susan, I think you're muted.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we do.
Excellent. Okay. So as Sarah said, I was working at environmental defense in 2014 during the Greenbelt and Growth Plan review. And one of the ways we wanted to inform people about the Greenbelt review was to identify some of the risks that were in the Greater Golden Horseshoe area. And the 413 was an excellent issue to highlight because it dealt with all the issues. It goes through the Greenbelt, it deals with climate change issues, it is backwards land use planning, it hit all the points we wanted to hit about how not to grow in the Greater Golden Horseshoe area. So it's a great campaign, and I'm very happy Sarah is running it now. So what we needed to do back then was we needed to get a campaign together, create all kinds of tools. So we started just like Sarah has done. We had a petition. We developed some blogs, a website. We did outreach in different communities, Kleinburg, Brampton, etc. I don't know if any of you remember back then. We were involved in the community back in those days. We got quite a bit of media attention, and we started lobbying Queen's Park. In those days, the Liberals were in power, and they were a government that consulted quite widely with the public, very different than the government we have today. In fact, they invited environmental defense to their policy convention, and I was lucky enough to present the 413 to Liberal Policy Convention, and they were not pleased to hear criticism about one of their policies and one of their platforms. So we were able to embarrass the minister in front of all his own people. And I think that was a major turning point. We also held these sprawl brawls, and you see the little ad there for the sprawl brawl. We had 3 rounds. One was transportation versus transit. One was smart growth versus sprawl, and the other one was farmland versus paving over farmland. So they were great little sessions that we held at U of T. We got a lot of students involved at that time. And then the province got an expert panel involved to give them some direction on where they should go. And the expert panel took about a year to talk about where they should go. They did some analysis and some modeling. They did some excellent legal analysis of the growth plan, the Greenbelt plan. And about a year later, after all this public pressure and media pressure, they decided to cancel the highway. Now, that's not going to happen quite so easily with this government, as we've seen. We've seen a lot of public pressure put on them, and they haven't moved. So Sarah has excellent mobilization skills, and she's done a fabulous campaign, but we need public involved more now than ever. So I encourage you to get involved and help out in this campaign. Going to move to the next slide. So in placement of highway infrastructure in greenfield areas, we need to invest public money in, the province is investing public money in perpetuating expensive car-dependent suburban growth, which Sarah said, it increases greenhouse gases, and it also fuels land speculation. The cost of highway-led development is far too high. We find sprawling low-density housing in bedroom communities throughout the Greater Golden Horseshoe. It's a problem because it requires people to drive further and further away to buy housing that they can afford. And single-family housing in the Greater Toronto area is no longer affordable. You've seen that it's a number of factors influencing that. Interest rates is one of them. The high cost of servicing land in those suburbs is another part of that. Land speculation is increasing the cost of land, and few housing options. The main housing option in the Greater Golden Horseshoe area is still the single-family home. More housing options make housing more affordable. And highway-led development also requires households to own 2 or more cars, and that increases household debt. It also adds to congestion on our highways. As highways are built, we also lose finite farmland resources, nature's ecosystems, functions and features are diminished, and so is our water quality. So this highway is going to be funded by your provincial tax dollars. And in 2019, the province allocated $22.1 billion to highways in the budget. Now, provincial dollars may support the placement of warehouses in wetlands, but it does little to reduce the cost of congestion on our highways. I mean, cost of congestion to our economy. And according to the principle of induced demand, as additional highway capacity becomes available, it encourages more people to drive, fueling gridlock and greenhouse gases. And perhaps most frustrating, the province is planning to use around $10 billion of our tax dollars to subsidize highway-led development, when we could be investing in more affordable, compact communities. Now, there is an economic vision for the region, one that does not include the GTA West. It's called the Innovation Corridor. The business community, from the Toronto Region Board of Trade to the region of Waterloo, City of Brampton, City of Guelph, Town of Richmond Hill, universities and colleges in the Greater Toronto area, all support this vision. It's investment in the region that directs growth to rapid transit and connects rapid transit to and from existing employment lands and schools, where the majority of the population works and goes to school. The corridor builds on existing infrastructure and improves transit connections. Our region is growing. Millions more people are expected to move to the Greater Golden Horseshoe area. And there are better ways to grow than following highway-led growth. Transit-supported densities in our existing urban areas with mixed uses, housing, and shops support a wider range of incomes. More equitable and accessible housing is needed moving forward, as in the next 10 years, there'll be more people over the age of 65 than ever before. Growing up around transit hubs also supports compact city building, a model that is consistent with the regional growth management model. As I mentioned earlier, low-density housing on farmland is expensive for buyers and for society. We could cut our urban footprint in half if we grew up just a little. 3 or 4 stories, triplexes, and walk-ups. Growing up makes more efficient use of land, maximizes infrastructure, reduces taxes, preserves farmland, protects natural areas, and reduces greenhouse gases. And people want smaller, more affordable homes closer to work, school, and transit. It's a win-win. But the province has changed important legislation that may result in the overdesignation of land, increases municipal debt, and eliminates important environmental protections that support healthy communities. These changes tend to benefit private interests, and if the GTA highway moves ahead, it reduces our opportunity to create smart cities like the 15-minute city. What's your vision of the future? More time stuck in traffic or more walkable, transit-friendly cities? It's the way that growth is managed that changes everything. Oh, sorry. Right now, regional governments are creating a plan for growth between now and 2051. You can have a say in how the future of the region unfolds by participating in the regional MCR process. I urge you to get involved to demand transit supportive growth and stop the 413. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Susan. So now is when we'll have some questions for Sarah and Susan. Let me just pull those up. Sarah, it looks like you already answered one in the chat, but I'm going to ask you to repeat it here just for anyone that hasn't read it yet. And this question was, what is the current stance of the Mississaugas of the Credit? How has the province consulted with them?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a tough one for me to answer personally. And I know that I haven't personally seen a stance from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We did reach out and have reached out at a couple points during the campaign just to say hello and introduce ourselves because this highway goes through a lot of the Mississaugas of the Credit treaty lands, and will definitely impact those treaty lands. So I think that's probably a better question to address to them. I don't want to speak for any folks that I can't speak for, but yeah, I do know that I think in the first iteration of the highway, there was an advisory group that included, I think, impacted First Nations. Susan, I don't know if you know if that has been activated again, but at least early on, I believe that First Nations who have lands along the path were, at least there was a start of a consultation. Hard to say if that's happening now.
Great, thank you. And Susan, we've got a question for you as well. Are any communities good examples or leaders of the sustainable growth you were describing, especially in the innovation corridor?
Yes, I am a big fan of Waterloo region, particularly the city of Kitchener and the city of Waterloo. I think they've done an excellent job. They've built up around their new ION, light rail transit. They have a whole economic strategy around building up in their downtown area. They have changed their zoning to allow the built form to change drastically. And they have a community that actually funded their light rail transit. That community, and that started from the community grassroots. They have trails. It is a wonderful community. And it was all fed by community leaders in that community. They have trail committees, they have economic development committees, they have downtown improvement committees. It's a fabulous city to emulate, and I would encourage anybody that hasn't looked into the city of Kitchener, the region of Waterloo's work on smart growth, I would encourage you to get involved and see what they've done.
Amazing, thank you. So we are getting on in time, so I'm going to forward to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Laura Bowman, a lawyer from Eco Justice Canada. Laura is going to speak about the at-risk species and habitats that could be affected by Highway 413. Please go ahead, Laura. Oh, Laura, you're muted.
Sorry about that. All right, so I was asked to speak a little bit about the habitat impacts of the GTA West Highway, and I'm also going to mention another highway, Bradford Bypass, which has a lot of similar issues with it. Let me just make sure I can go forward. All right, so the GTA West Highway, it's about 50 kilometers for the main highway, and there's about 10 more kilometers of highway extensions that attach to it. It's a pretty significant piece of land that would be used by the highway. It would be about 110 meters for the road portion of the highway, another 60 meters for an associated transitway, and then another 60 meters for a transmission line corridor, which is planned to be associated with the highway corridor. So between the quite long length of the highway and the extreme width of the highway right-of-way and the associated transmission right-of-way, I have to emphasize that this is an extremely large area of land that is directly impacted by the destruction that the construction of the highway would entail. The vast majority of the route goes through either greenbelt lands or highly productive farmland. It also goes through a number of river corridors that are important wildlife corridors, such as Humber River, the Credit River, 16 Mile Creek. And these habitat corridors contain very important wetlands and woodlands. There is around 85 river crossings that would be involved, although the exact number isn't fully known. The TRCA did an analysis of the route, which is why we have some of this information. The proponent, the Ministry of Transportation, has not completed wildlife surveys or habitat surveys for the selected route so that we can actually see the full extent of the damage. But the Toronto Run Region Conservation Authority did do some of its own work to try and figure out what the impacts would be. Some of the impacts include that it would go through a very large conservation area, bisecting it and thereby destroying its integrity, the Nashville Conservation Area near Bolton. And there are a large number of species at risk, including the red-side dace, which I've got on my slide here, which is a really cute little minnow with a red stripe that jumps out of the water to catch bugs. It is an extremely endangered fish. It only lives in a handful of creeks in Ontario. Most of them are in the GTA, and this area where the GTA West would go is one of the last headwater areas that actually has suitable habitat for this fish. So there is a real risk that with the highway, the transmission line, and associated sprawl that would bring, that this fish could be extirpated from Ontario, which means it would no longer exist in Ontario. The Toronto Region Conservation Authority's analysis concluded that there would be extensive and widespread impacts on habitat that could not be mitigated, that there would be significant fragmentation of valley islands and conservation lands and the remaining natural corridors throughout that entire stretch of the route. 1,000 hectares of important wildlife habitat would be impacted. And this doesn't even take into account the cumulative effects of the sprawl that would come with the highway. We know that most of the highway's route is white belt lands, which means they're not protected by the Greenbelt Plan. And because of that, we know that there are very large and powerful developers with an interest in moving forward developments adjacent to this highway, including one that recently got obscure planning approval called the Minister's Zoning Order on the north end of Brampton on the Caledon line side in Mayfield. So we know that there are powerful people that want to be able to develop the lands adjacent to this highway, who have purchased these lands and are hoping the highway will come through so that they can make a profit on their land purchases. Similarly, the Bradford Bypass Highway, it's a shorter highway, but a large middle section of the highway would go through one of Southern Ontario's most important wetlands, the Holland Marsh, which is at the bottom end of Lake Simcoe. Again, it goes through greenbelt lands. There's, similar to the GTA West, a significant removal of large pieces of woodland. And in this case, there was an environmental assessment done by the province back in 1997, so it's 24 years old. But that environmental assessment predicted severe groundwater and stormwater contamination from this highway. So things like chloride and nutrients would go into the Holland River and into Lake Simcoe from the construction of this highway. And we don't know this information for GTA West because the GTA West consultants haven't done this analysis. So, you know, sometimes it's hard to compare between the two because the EA for GTA West is less complete than the EA for Bradford Bypass was. Because it was done way back in 1997, the consultants tended to be a little bit more upfront with impacts in some of the older environmental assessments. And this one, they've just chosen a route. They haven't done the wildlife surveys. They haven't done the analysis of the full water contamination impacts. So I saw there was a question about that. I can't answer these questions for GTA West because MTO hasn't given us that information, although we've requested it. So one of the biggest issues with both of these highways is that back in July, the province posted on what's called the Environmental Registry, which is a public consultation website, a proposed exemption for each of these highways that would allow what they call early works to occur before the environmental assessment is completed. The Bradford Bypass, even though it has a completed EA, had a bunch of conditions of approval that had to be fulfilled, including studying the groundwater contamination more, studying noise and other things more. And this proposed exemption would allow it not to do that. Similarly, the GTA West Highways proposed exemption implies that they would just go ahead and start digging up these sensitive valley lands and installing bridges before they actually did the environmental impact analysis. So if you do that, then there's no point. I mean, the thing's already built by the time you've done the analysis. Normally, you know, you evaluate the impacts, you try and find ways to minimize the impacts before you start building. That's the whole purpose of those analyses. So if you've already built it before you do those reports, there's basically no EA at that point. That's why we've requested a federal EA. We have submitted to the Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change a request to designate both of these projects under the Federal Impact Assessment Act. If that happens, then the federal government can take on decision-making authority for this highway. They can decide whether or not certain parts of it can proceed. They can impose conditions on the highway, either to mitigate effects or to, you know, change the route. They can do all kinds of things. So what someone asked a question about, you know, how do you deal with the fact that the Ford government is maybe not as receptive to certain campaign angles? One way that we've approached that is to just try and get the federal government involved. Particularly because of the proposed exemptions for these two highways, we think that there's a good case for the federal government to get involved. And you know, it also opens up the possibility of not only more rigorous assessment of typical federal issues like fish and migratory birds and water quality, but also the federal government has more of a tendency to force proponents to analyze climate change and conduct health impact assessments, which is something that the Ministry of Transportation normally does not do. And they have, quite frankly, a history of denialism and anti-scientific analysis on things like noise and air quality. So for example, they deny that highways cause regional air quality problems. They deny that highways cause increases in particulate matter, even though these things are scientifically quite well established. And so we feel federal EA would help with some of those issues as well. What we really need from you is for the federal minister and the impact assessment agency federally to hear from people, individual people that are supportive of our request to designate these two highways. We have a narrow window of 90 days from when we submitted our request on February 3rd to get the minister to designate this project. After the 90 days, if the minister doesn't want to do it, we're stuck with the provincial process, however flawed it may be. So please, 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 you can click on either of these links and submit a comment to the Impact Assessment Agency. And you can also go to Environmental Defense's webpage, and there's a petition that goes directly to Minister Wilkinson requesting the designation of both of these highways. So you get a 2-for-1 with that petition. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. We do have a couple questions for you. First, Erica asks, what is the loophole that would allow the government to build over greenbelt land and conservative areas that are supposed to be protective? Or conservation areas, excuse me.
Well, unfortunately, highways are exempt from most environmental laws in Ontario. So while the Greenbelt Plan does impose requirements on infrastructure like highways, they're not actually enforceable. So the province doesn't actually have to comply with the Greenbelt Plan requirements when they make decisions to approve the highway. So that's been one challenge in terms of enforcing the Greenbelt protections. There really isn't any way to do that. And similarly, highways are exempt from all kinds of endangered species requirements. They're exempt from conservation authority requirements, and really leaves highway projects kind of in this vacuum where they can do things that no other project could do. So that's really the challenge. Without a robust environmental assessment, we have no real way of addressing those issues.
One more question. How else can we help or get involved to push the federal government to be involved in the decision?
You can also contact your member of parliament. That's really helpful. It's good if they hear from you as well as Minister Wilkinson and the Impact Assessment Agency. I can't emphasize enough how, hearing from large numbers of people that care about this is really the most impactful thing that you can do. The criteria that the federal government considers, one of the most important criteria is public concern. And so the way that they'll evaluate that is how many people they hear from. So write to them, get your friends to write to them, call them, make your voice heard as loudly and as frequently as possible so that they know that you're not just someone passively signing a petition or leaving a comment, that you're someone who is really motivated by this issue.
Perfect. Thank you. Now I believe we're at our final speaker, Sunny Ray from Sustainable Vaughan. He's here to explain why new highways aren't going to solve congestion issues, and he'll offer some transportation alternatives to the proposed Highway 413. Take it away, Sunny.
Hi, everyone. I think I have a presentation that I sent earlier. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so it's this is a newspaper article from 1955, and it's some people may know about this, but it's was a large kind of plan about bringing a number of highways into the downtown core. So this is dating back to a time when highways were seen as a progressive thing. So now fast forward 2020, and we're still fighting the same kind of battles in terms of dictating how we want to, grow our urban areas and protect our natural areas. And of course, Don Valley Expressway exists, but the Spadina Expressway and the Humber Expressway were canceled. Spadina Expressway, of course, is now public transportation. It was converted into a subway line, and currently the route that was preserved for the Humber Expressway along Eglinton Avenue is actually being now planned as a LRT route to the airport. Next slide. And it's been mentioned by the other speakers, the idea of induced demand. So the idea that building more highway capacity doesn't actually alleviate traffic congestion, but actually invites more traffic to the roads. So as soon as you build new roads, they quickly fill up. One of the disappointing things is the Minister of Transportation, Caroline Mulrooney, continues to boast that the 413 highway will actually alleviate traffic congestion. She's wrong. It's quite embarrassing now after this knowledge has been out for since the 90s that this problem of building new highways does not alleviate traffic congestion is around. So if you experience politicians expressing this opinion, you should really refute this because it does not happen. And on 413 is actually more problematic because of course the highway is planned through wipeout lands through Caledon. So that's 11,300 hectares of lands that are designated for future growth. And the province aims to grow those, or to build on those lands against the highway, really creating sprawl. So the whole idea of the highway is not to reduce traffic congestion. In fact, it's actually to sprawl the province northward and to build more car-dependent communities. Next slide. I just threw this in there. My good friend Stephen Roberts, early on, 10 years ago, when we started fighting the highway, we created this graphic of what the highway would look like through Vaughan, from stretching from 400 across, really to kind of highlight the kind of impact through the natural areas and both agricultural and protected greenbelt lands in Vaughan. Of course, assume that some of these areas would get built adjacent to, so the impact would be far greater. But I find the graphics are quite useful to use like this to kind of really hit home on the reality of this highway. Next slide. So environmental defense, transportation action, Toronto or Ontario, and sustainable Vaughan put together a paper really looking at the alternatives to the highway. And it was really looking at planned or proposed transportation, public transportation projects and infrastructure projects throughout the GTA, in the west part of the GTA, primarily near the proposed highway route. And then really looking at those impacts of those versus the highway. And this map is quite telling because the highway in red to the top of the page and to the left is really going through areas that are colored yellow, which there are no people kind of living there. It's really kind of quite agricultural or protected landscapes. And then the lines in purple and blue are the more urbanized areas where those transit projects that we highlighted were going. So the impact to existing urban areas and where people actually live was more important to us to study, to move people away from and alleviate traffic congestion in those areas as opposed to a highway in non-urbanized areas. So really, this highway, and I can't state it enough, is not meant to alleviate traffic congestion. It's meant to open up lands for development, and that's car-dependent development. Next slide. And then one of the things that was done in that study was to really look at the cost of the highway versus some key transportation projects. And we found that, with a slightly higher cost than what we think the highway will cost, but we don't know if the $6 billion that we're looking at is actually correct for the highway, you could actually move 3 times as many people in existing urbanized areas than you can with the highway being proposed that's going through really less rural areas. Next slide. And I just want to highlight a couple of projects in Peel in particular. that really are impacted by this highway, or it could be, I guess, could be visions or alternates to this highway. And then the first one's the Heritage Heights development proposed by Brampton Council. And that's looking at really creating a new urbanized area on a greenfield site, but connected to transit. So if you look at the left of the page, you can see that area highlighted. So really looking at one of the last unurbanized areas of Brampton, but looking at how to build a denser community, more walkable and urbanized around the GO train station versus a highway. And one of the problems, if you go to the next slide, is that proposal actually is right in the middle of where the highway is going through. So you can see that black line in the middle. We're actually oriented the opposite direction. So really, you know, credit to Brampton for you know, really trying to create a vision around this highway, but in reality, the two don't mix. And I think Patrick Brown is learning this, and I thank him for actually bringing this forward, because it actually muddied the waters, and it really kind of brought home a really important point, which is you can't have both. You got to choose one over the other. And for the future growth of Brampton, both economically and to house more people and more jobs, the actually urbanized area without the highway is actually preferable. If you go to the next slide. So this is one of the proposals that the planners that were working on this project brought through, which is to create a boulevard for the highway. So kind of to kind of alleviate the highway into a kind of more urbanized space. It's actually ridiculous. It's 100 meters across. It would take an able-bodied person a minute to walk across. So people have to tell an email, if you live in Brampton, your counselor, that this is a hogwash, and you need to demand that they cancel the highway and create a real urbanized area, one that's actually really walkable and does not include the expanse of this boulevard. Next slide. And then one of the I think the great infrastructure projects that's been lost and not talked about enough is the idea of creating commuter rail on the Bolton rail line. And this is from a report that was done 10 years ago by Metrolinx. Back 10 years ago, Metrolinx actually said that this proposal is feasible. I believe it's more feasible now, because many of the infrastructure improvements that were highlighted in this report were actually completed as part of the Up Express railway line, which this line would actually connect onto. Next slide. And it really looks at an alternative vision for accommodating growth within a place like Caledon, and really looking at concentrating growth within Bolton, an already urbanized area, but now providing a higher order transit connection to Bolton. One of the things that's problematic about the highway stretching through Caledon is there is no other planned higher order transportation routes, particularly rail, that are going through there. So that building a highway through Caledon and allowing growth around that would always be car dependent. But this proposes an alternative where you can actually have growth connected to transit infrastructure. And you can see newer stations within Kleinburg, Langstaff, and Woodbridge, which are already urbanized areas as well. Next slide. And this is just a newspaper headline from when the public convinced a previously stubborn premier to cancel the Spadina Expressway. It took many years. It wasn't easy. It was a very drawn out and difficult fight, but the public fought back against that expressway and fought to protect, what they thought was important, which was their downtown urbanized area. So, these are long fights. I always say it's a marathon, not a sprint, but you can really push back hard, and it does make a difference. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sunny. We do have a couple questions for you. I've been saving them from the beginning because they're about the highway. The first one is, can the 407 be repurposed as an alternative to the 413?
Yeah, I think that was addressed in the report that the previous Minister of Transportation, Stephen Del Duca, had commissioned, and that really looked at providing a truck-only access lane along Highway 407. Back then, one of the larger lobbyists for the highway was the trucking industry, and that was something that was looked at that time.
We've got one more for you. Rahul asks, any update on the 407 having to pay congestion payments due to low volume?
Yeah, I haven't been following that, but I know that the reference is to a great article by Paul Webster, really investigated the issue with the 407, and an issue I didn't understand is that if that highway is below a certain capacity, that they are actually forced to pay back to the province a congestion charge. So it's one of the things that was highlighted in that article was the idea of allowing truck access at a reduced rate to both create a bit more demand on that highway.
And Karen asks, is the boulevard only for vehicles or is there any space for humans?
Yeah, I mean, the graphic I showed was really it's a high level, secondary plan at this stage that was presented. I don't think anything that's 100 meters wide that's primarily for cars would be for humans, both along it or across it. So I think people should really dismiss this idea that Brampton Council has come up with. I mean, I might credit them. They made a big effort to try to marry two things that should not go together.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And thank you to all our wonderful speakers for their presentations this evening. And of course, to all of you for joining us today. Now, if you're interested in contributing to the Stop the 413 movement, here are your action items. First, voice your concerns to your municipal government. Email your elected officials. Let them know that you're unhappy with the proposed highway. And if you're up to it, attend city council meetings and put on a deputation. Local opposition is exactly what we need to stop this highway. In fact, just yesterday, Mississauga City Council unanimously passed a motion opposing the construction of Highway 413. And this came off deputations from local residents, so we know we're being heard. I also implore you all to join your local volunteer groups and get involved that way. If you'd like to stay informed on the Stop the 413 movement, you can join the Facebook group titled Stop the 413. If you prefer Instagram, you can check out hashtag Stop the 413 and our new Instagram page at Stop the 413. If you're interested in supporting the Community Climate Council, here are a few ways to do so. You can volunteer with us directly. We're currently recruiting for certain roles. You can find more information on our official website. You can also share our work and get the word out. Community engagement and information sharing is how we promote climate literacy. And if you're in a position to do so, you can also donate to us. The Community Climate Council is comprised entirely of volunteers. We pay for our organizational expenses through our personal funding, government grants, and donations. So your generosity is greatly appreciated. And lastly, here is our contact information. You can check out our website, our Instagram page, our Twitter, or shoot us an email if you're interested in connecting with us. Once again, thank you to all of our lovely speakers and of course to our attendees for being here today. We hope you learned something and we hope you're ready to stop the 413. Thank you and have a lovely evening.